All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your patience as we all settle into the webinar room. We'll begin in just a moment. All right, and welcome to our MPF webinar, Wetlands for Native Bees with Molly Jacobson. My name is Amanda Lance-Ramrab, and I'm the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. Thank you all for joining us today for the next webinar of our 2025 series. We'll now review a couple of Zoom basics. Today's webinar will feature a presentation and Q&A session. When you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen, which you'll find on the bar at the bottom of your window. Questions placed into the chat will be redirected to the Q&A section. Molly Grimmeroth, our MPF Conservation Program Associate, will join Molly on screen at the end of the presentation to read your submitted questions aloud. Thanks in advance for your thoughtful live submissions. We hope to cover as much as possible. Access to this recording and other related information will be sent to all who registered in a follow-up email tomorrow. Now to introduce our speaker, Molly Jacobson. Molly is a pollinator ecologist at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, located in upstate New York. There, she received her master's in science and conservation biology in 2021, studying the effects of wetland management techniques on pollinator habitat. She is currently involved with a variety of research projects across the Northeast to better understand rare specialist bees and to manage and create high quality pollinator habitat, especially in urban settings. Much of her time is also spent educating the public through outreach, like today's event, or in the lab identifying bees under the microscope. She is grateful for any day she can get outside into nature and inspire others to appreciate even the smallest creatures that are all around us. Molly, it's so great to have you join us from your lab out east. Thank you for making this time to speak to our MPF audience.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Molly.
So I'll get started then. Thank you all for coming. I'll be presenting today on part of my master's research about the pollinator communities in managed wetlands and how they're an important part of the landscape when it comes to protecting native bees, particularly as habitat towards the end of the growing season. My work does take place in the Northeast, or really on the cusp of the Great Lakes region, but the principles are broadly applicable to where you guys might be tuning in from as well. So let's start off by talking a little bit about our native bees. Here in the US, there's around 3,600 different species of bees, including all of the ones that you see here. Where my work takes place in New York State, we have 450 different bee species. What isn't included here is the bee that we might be most familiar with, the honeybee, and that's because honeybees aren't native to North America. But as you can see, native bees are incredibly diverse in their forms, colors, and behaviors, and consequently in the role that they play in their ecosystems. Bees are visiting flowers primarily for two reasons. Firstly, to drink nectar, which is the sugary fuel that adults use to power their own activities, and to collect pollen, which is the source of protein and nutrients that their larvae eat. Contrary to popular belief, most bees don't live in hives or make honey. The vast majority, around 3/4 of them, are completely solitary. What this means is that after mating, it's just one female bee that makes a nest, goes out and forages for pollen, and does everything she can to ensure the success of the next generation. She will never meet her offspring. She'll put a ball of pollen in each nest chamber, lay an egg on it, and close that nest up. The larvae will develop on that pollen for months, and then usually overwinter before pupating and emerging the next year as an adult. The mother, though, only lives for about a month or so, just long enough to make a nest or two. Most of our bees are also ground nesters, around 70%. So they're digging these small tunnels that, for the most part, go unnoticed by people. Now, we do have a handful of native bees that are social with colonies, but they're not nearly as complex as those of honeybees. That includes bumblebees and some kinds of sweat bees. We also have a good number of bees that nest above ground in cavities, like in dead plant stems or wood. We even have some bees that are nest parasites of other bees, and we call these cuckoo bees, like this one you can see in the top right-hand corner. This is a lifestyle, not really an actual group of bees, because this nest parasitism has evolved multiple times across different bee families. They do visit flowers, but they don't collect pollen because they don't make their own nest. They seek out the nest of a particular host bee and they'll lay their eggs in that nest. So their larvae can eat the pollen that was meant for the host larva. These cuckoo bees to me are really cool and they're very diverse. And there's actually more kinds of cuckoo bees in the world than there are social bees that live in colonies. So really, when it comes down to it, the average native bee doesn't live in a hive. It's a solitary ground nester. Now, of course, there's great interest in bees because of their importance to agriculture. But a lot of that narrative is centered around honeybees, and native bees contribute a lot more than people tend to give them credit for. Numerous studies have found that native bees are more efficient and effective pollinators of several major fruit crops compared to honeybees, because they have a diversity of foraging behaviors and activity periods. So having wild pollinators on farms can have a tangible benefit for farmers' yields. Some crops, like tomatoes and blueberries, can't be pollinated by honeybees at all because they need buzz pollination, which is something some native bees can do, but honeybees can't. A study of apple orchards here in New York found 140 species of bees visiting apple trees. So alongside the services that they provide to us for free, our farms can provide important floral resources to bees too. This relationship we have with pollinators is critical for food production in this country. But the importance of wild pollinators goes far beyond agriculture, of course. They make possible the habitats that support ecosystem services and the wildlife that we rely on and enjoy. Now, not all flowers are created equal for pollinators. Bees have preferences for what they'll visit, based in part on traits like the size of the insect and the length of its tongue, which limit what flower shapes it can access. Flowers like those in the aster family, which we call composites, are small and shallow, and that makes those resources readily available to a lot of different insects. We tend to see smaller bees and those with shorter tongues on those kinds of flowers. When it comes to the flowers that are deep, like legumes, mints, penstemons, blueberries, flowers that have a tube or a bell shape or have a convoluted entrance that bees need to squeeze into or pry open, this tends to favor those larger bodied bees and those with long tongues. Those bees will still visit shallow flowers, but they have a distinct advantage when it comes to accessing the deeper flowers, so there's less competition for those resources. The other thing that determines what flowers a bee will visit is its diet breadth. This has to do with the co-evolved relationships that bees have with native plants. Most bees are what we call generalists to varying degrees. So they'll visit many kinds of unrelated flowers to collect pollen, filtered by those things like body size and tongue length that pose a physical barrier. But there's a spectrum of increasing specialization, where bees might only visit flowers from one plant family for their pollen, or maybe even just one genus of plants. At its most extreme, a bee might rely on just one single kind of flower for all of the pollen it will feed its young. We think this might be rooted in the chemical makeup of the pollen itself, like the unique defensive compounds that these bee larvae have evolved to digest in the same way caterpillars do, or even the unique microbiome of the pollen. Flowers with unique shapes or a unique biology, like many desert plants that only flower for a short time after spring rains, that might also lend itself to having specialist bees. The lives of specialists are closely interwoven with their host plants, and that makes them tied to native plants and native landscapes. Many specialists are some of our rarest and most least understood bees, and many are at risk of decline or extirpation. In the eastern US broadly, around a quarter of our bees are specialists, including the ones that you see here. And the plants that host the greatest diversity of specialists are goldenrods, sunflowers, asters, and coneflowers, which are all in the aster family. If you zoom into the northeast, this does change a little, and that's probably due to the shift in habitats from grassland to greater forest cover. So our top four plants here where I am are goldenrods, willows, blueberries, and asters. So we've actually got woody plants that are really critical to supporting specialist bees. At the same time as having these diet specialists, we also have bees that are tied to specific habitats, so habitat specialists. So for example, here we see the blueberry cellophane bee, which is one of my favorite bees. And you'll only find it in these sorts of sandy power line rights of way, open scrub oak woodlands, and fire lanes. This bee specializes on blueberries, so that's its host plant, but you wouldn't find it in any old blueberry orchard. It only nests in sandy soils. So you have multiple criteria that have to be met in order to have this bee. And that ties it to these sorts of blueberry heath habitats you tend to find up in New England. So some bees are diet specialists and habitat specialists. Some are just one or the other, and some are neither. But this is an added dimension of predicting where these species will occur and what we need to do to protect them and the habitats they rely on. One key aspect of pollinator habitat that bees depend on is bloom turnover. And this is something you might have heard of if you have a pollinator garden in your own yard. Bloom turnover is having multiple kinds of flowers present at any given time and different species coming and going over the course of the season, so there's no gap in floral resources from spring through fall. Ideally, these flowers should also be different shapes to support those long-tongued and short-tongued bees at the same time. This is really critical for our native social bees like bumblebees who do live in colonies and that are active all season, so they need continuous resources. But it's also important for the many, many bees that are only active for a short time, just a few weeks, and they need those flowers to be there during that key window. That includes our specialists too, who need their host plants to be present predictably year after year at the same time. Bloom turnover can occur on a local scale, like within a single habitat, and that can be important for small bees that don't fly very far. But it's also present on the landscape scale across multiple habitats. Different habitats might provide floral resources most abundantly at different times of year, and together they might make up that full suite of resources that bees are relying on. So bees often move between habitats to find what they need. They might use forests in spring and then move to meadows in the summer. Or maybe they are nesting in the woods, but they're foraging in the meadow. So different parts of the landscape work cohesively to support our wild pollinators. And this is all important when we consider that so many native bees are experiencing severe and rapid declines. While things like pesticides, disease, and climate change are all contributing to bee declines, the major driver, probably the most important, is habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. That is to say that we are losing habitat quantity, habitat quality, and habitat connectivity that bees need to have enough resources to support healthy populations. So it's really critical that we understand the value of different habitats to our wild bees, so we can effectively protect those places that support our bee diversity, including the rare and specialized bees that often fly under the radar. One of these habitats is wetlands, and wetlands have also faced tremendous threats here in the US. Since the time of the American Revolution, over half of our wetlands have been lost by being converted to agriculture, being dammed, or being drained for development. Here in New York State, we've lost around 60% of our wetlands, while in Missouri, it's 87%. Hundreds of species of wildlife rely on wetlands for all or part of their life cycles. In particular, waterfowl, like ducks, use wetlands not just during migration, but millions also breed in the vast system of wetlands in the central US and Canada called the Prairie Pothole region, which has been severely threatened by agriculture. Declines in waterfowl populations spurred some of the first wetland conservation in the early 20th century, spearheaded by waterfowl hunters, and legislation passed in the 1980s, like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, really kickstarted a national effort to restore millions of acres of wetlands across the country. Thankfully, waterfowl populations have rebounded, but we continue to lose wetlands to agricultural expansion. Restoration of wetlands, like those that were tilled farm fields, involves reinstating the cycles of hydrology they once had that were cut off when they were drained and farmed. Here you can see an aerial view of some of the wetlands where my research took place, and it's clear that they were once corn and soybean fields. So the first step to restoring hydrology is to divide wetlands into individual impoundments that are separated by raised areas called berms or dikes that act as both barriers and access roads for management. This way, each impoundment can be managed individually. The next step is installing water control structures, which you see in the top left here. These are pretty simple mechanisms that can control the flow of water very precisely to allow each impoundment to be flooded or drained to specified levels. Many wetland systems benefit from this annual cycle of flooding and drying to maintain productive habitat, because it mimics what would naturally occur if that wetland was connected to a river. So land managers flood and draw down the impoundment seasonally to accomplish a number of goals to keep the wetlands healthy. Firstly, it refreshes nutrients and oxygen flow in the water. It also promotes many plants that need exposure to mudflats for their seeds to germinate. It creates dynamic systems that keeps wetlands in an early successional state with greater plant diversity, as opposed to more homogeneous stands of cattail that result from years without disturbance. In this sense, it also helps control invasive plants like Phragmites reed and reed canary grass by stressing them over and over through drastic water level changes. And lastly, probably the biggest goal for land managers is that it creates really productive habitat for wildlife, including the many waterfowl, shorebirds, and wading birds that rely on wetlands. So the plant communities that are produced in drawdowns offer copious amounts of seeds and invertebrates as food, as well as dense cover during migration and the breeding season. So these wetlands are generally flooded in spring and then drawn down over the course of the summer, and the changes can be dramatic. So here's an example of one of my study sites. I'll show you here, the same impoundment over the course of the summer. So it starts off as shallow water, it's then drained to mudflat, and then after a couple of months, wetland annuals germinate, and it becomes this, which is almost head height. And that will all go to seed when those waterfowl are coming through. And this is what we call a full drawdown, where all of the water is drained. It's also sometimes referred to as moist soil management, as you often end up with wetlands that are completely dry during the peak of the growing season. On the flip side, you can use that water control to create more stable systems that are maybe only drained once every few years or once every several years. This more passive approach, where water is retained, can create these deeper water systems that we more typically think of as emergent marshes that have cattails, water lilies, pickerel weed, and submerged aquatic vegetation. These prefer less disturbance and have substantial wildlife value for many breeding marsh birds, fish, amphibians, muskrats, and other species. So the plant communities that result from this hydrological management vary based on the timing, the speed, the extent, and the frequency of drawdowns. A lot of thought goes into planning what kinds of plant communities are needed to meet wildlife goals and how we can encourage those in the right proportions. The management of impoundments is also rotated annually, usually, so that a wetland that had a full drawdown one year might not have one the next. Management is also adapted to local conditions, like, for instance, one year having a drought, which might mean you need fewer full drawdowns, since some wetlands will just dry up on their own. So land managers make these decisions both on the scale of what an individual impoundment needs and on the scale of an entire wetland complex, with dozens or even hundreds of impoundments working together to create a matrix of diverse conditions that helps meet the needs of all target species. So let's bring this back to bees. Wetlands are notoriously understudied when it comes to their pollinator communities, especially wetlands that are managed in the ways that I just described. We do this management primarily for birds, with very little data on how it might be supporting pollinators too. Where these emergent wetlands exist naturally, even in small degraded pockets, researchers found that they can provide important refuge from the threats of agriculture and offer resources to help pollinators persist in these areas, even contributing to spillover pollination benefits for farmers. We also know that there are wetland-associated bees, like the two that you see here. And these are going to be overlooked when we only promote meadows and gardens as pollinator habitat. So with my research, I wanted to help gain a greater understanding of the bee communities that managed wetlands support and the role that emergent wetlands might be playing for bees on the larger landscape, at least here in the Northeast. So my research took place at the Montezuma Wetlands Complex and the Seneca Meadows Wetlands Preserve, and these are both located in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. If we zoom in here, you can see a rough outline of these properties, and they currently encompass around 50,000 acres of restored wetlands and some uplands as well. And it's split between federal, state, and private ownership. This entire area used to be wetlands, but it's been greatly reduced for agriculture and the Erie Canal. So a lot of these wetlands are being restored from farm fields. And as you can see, the surrounding landscape is severely fragmented by agriculture. This area is also really highly important for waterfowl as it sits right along the Atlantic Flyway, and we get millions of ducks, snow geese, and other water birds that come through each year to use these wetlands. So the wetlands at Montezuma and Seneca Meadows that I studied span a wide range of conditions, and I focused on those that were dominated by herbaceous vegetation. So emergent marsh plants, submerged aquatic vegetation, all of those moist soil or wet meadow type plants, as opposed to swamps or scrub shrub wetlands that are in a later stage of succession with more woody plants. Even the driest looking sites here, like this field of Walter's millet on the bottom left, are flooded for at least part of the year. So our sites really ranged from deep water cattail marshes to shallow water to mud flats to moist soil communities. I surveyed plants and pollinators for 2 years in these wetlands, visiting 33 impoundments once a month for 4 months each year. To catch bees, we use a couple of standard methods. So firstly, we use pan traps, also known as bee bowls, and that's these neon colored cups here that are filled with soapy water. We leave them out for a day and they will attract and collect bees. We also use sweep netting, which is actively collecting bees off of flowers. We sweep each species of flower separately, so later we can link up what bee was caught on what flower. And that's where the really valuable data comes from about the flowers that bees prefer to visit, and so we can get a sense of how the bees are using that habitat. I also took quite a lot of other information about the plant communities and the environmental conditions as well. So we took phenological observations, which is we were noting what was blooming during each site visit. And also we took many other types of data about the plant communities like species diversity, vegetation height, and water depth. Now, those data are actually part of another chapter of my master's research that we are still writing up about how the bees respond to those drawdowns statistically. So I won't be including a lot of that here, but we will see the phenology come up again later. Now, the data that we get from sweeping bees off of flowers goes into making these plant pollinator networks. And this is basically a way of visualizing the ways that plants and bees interact in a habitat. So on one side, you have each plant species, and on the other side, you have each bee species. Those yellow bars represent an interaction that we documented when we caught that bee from that flower. And the thickness of those bars are how often we recorded that interaction. So for instance, this little Ceratina here likes to visit many kinds of flowers, but tends to visit some more than others. And we can see that reflected in the network. On the other hand, we can have more exclusive interactions like a specialist with its host plant. So this broad-footed cellophane bee only visits ground cherry, and that ground cherry doesn't get a whole lot of other visitors besides its specialists. So we can see that here in the network. So we can look at these networks from both the bee side and the plant side. So this is the same network, I've just turned it on its side, and I promise this is the only statistical jargon slide I will have for you. So we can analyze these networks to learn about their structure, and that can tell us something about the habitat and maybe how well it's doing in terms of stability and resilience in the face of human impacts. So at the level of this whole network, we can look at these three things. So connectance is the proportion of the interactions that we documented compared to all possible interactions between bees and plants. Not all bees visit all flowers, as we just learned, but if we see huge gaps, that might signal that flowers maybe aren't getting the pollination services they need. We can also look at nestedness, which is whether those specialist interactions are a subset of generalist ones. That would mean that there's redundancy, that the host plant is also getting visited by some other bees that can ensure it gets pollinated if the specialist disappeared. And then there's modularity, which is how compartmentalized the networks, the interactions are. So you can see here, for example, this set of interactions that are separate from the rest. Those bees that visit those plants aren't really visiting anything else in the network. And that creates this isolated little bubble. That might leave those plants at risk if there's some kind of disturbance and they're not getting any traffic from other members of the network that would give them some insurance or redundancy. So generally, we find that networks that have a greater connectance, a greater nestedness, and a lower modularity tend to be more stable, and so that habitat might hold up better in the face of human impacts. We can also look at the species level in these networks and something called degree. So this is basically the same thing as connectance, but on a per species basis. So we would ask, what proportion of all possible floral hosts did we actually record for that bee? Or how many kinds of bee visited that flower out of all possible bees? It's a measure of how well connected each species is to others in that habitat. So what did we find in these wetlands? We collected 109 different species of bees, which is around a quarter of all the species in New York State. We had 19 different kinds of pollen specialists and 4 wetland habitat specialists, so bees that are only found in wetlands. And that includes the 3 that you see here, the water lily masked bee, the pickerelweed short-faced bee, and the water lily sweat bee. We also found 2 at-risk bumblebee species, the golden northern bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, and the northern amber bumblebee, Bombus borealis. We found a grassland-associated bee that's only rarely seen in the Northeast, Melisodes bidentis. It's typically more of a Midwest or prairie bee, and it might be using some of the restored grasslands at Montezuma. Now this photo here of the Melisodes as well as the water lily sweat bee you saw on the previous slide, those actually are of our own specimens. They were a notable enough find that we had professional photos of them taken by some of our talented colleagues. So we're really proud of those. We also found a sand obligate bee, Agapostemon splendens here, this bottom photo. And we found quite a lot of them. So we had several hundred. And this was a mystery for quite a while because these wetlands have muck soils. So what's a sand bee doing there? But we found that there are actually deep sand deposits along the shore of the Seneca River that runs through the area. And that made it possible to have this unusual bee outside of its normal coastal habitat. Now, when it comes to diversity, we had the greatest generic richness of bees in August. So generic richness is how many genera of bees that we found, and genera is the plural of genus. So this can sometimes be more telling in an ecological sense than just species diversity, since genera tend to differ more in their biology and ecological niches from each other than species tend to. So August had this high generic richness, meaning bees with many different lifestyles and functional roles were all being supported by these wetlands at this time. And of our specialists, 90% of them were collected in August or September, which we're referring to together as the late season. And that includes all the species you see here. Nearly 2/3 of those specialists were only found during this time frame. How about the flowers in these wetlands? There was certainly no shortage of flowers. Both the actively managed wetlands with the drawdowns, as well as the more passively managed ones with more water, had a diversity of floral resources. So let's dig into that a little bit more. This here is a figure from our paper, and there is no need to try and read that tiny Latin text, but focus here on the lines, which is the bloom period that we recorded for each flower from those phenology observations. Once again, August had the greatest diversity of blooming flowers. And when we split this up into the early, middle, and late season, it is that late season, the August through mid-September, that had the greatest diversity as well. And you can see on this visual how many more plants had bloom periods falling within this window. At the same time, many of the early blooming plants were actually non-native species that might not really be representative of what these wetland systems would naturally be. So let's look at just a handful of these late blooming wetland flowers. We can see there's such a diversity of colors and forms, and we know that's important for supporting all of these different guilds of bees, like the long and short-tongued species. Upland fields and meadows also do have a lot of late blooming flowers, but they aren't typically this diverse in form. They really lean towards a lot of aster family plants. Wetlands have a lot of these deeper flowers, which maybe are a little harder to find elsewhere on the landscape at this time. And so here we can see our plant pollinator network. It's quite a bit more busy than the example I showed you before, but the principle is the same. This is a snapshot of the interactions between bees and plants in our wetlands over 2 years. And I wanted to highlight one of the more interesting interactions that you can see in this little photo down here. We had sweat bees visiting the flowers of burrweed. Burrweed is related to cattail, so it's a wind-pollinated plant, yet it was serving as a pollen source for these small bees. And that's something that's never been recorded in the scientific literature before. So I think that was pretty cool and unique. We can also look here at that measure that we call degree, which is which bees were most connected in our network and visited more kinds of flowers than other bees. And the first 3 on this list are pretty unsurprising. The European honeybee was number 1. This is a very generalist bee, and there were honeybee hives on the property. And after that, common eastern bumblebees, brown-belted bumblebees, also very generalist. But this last one here was pretty unexpected. This is our little water lily masked bee that I showed you a few slides ago, one of the wetland habitat specialists. Masked bees in general are fairly common, but they're not really considered major components of any habitat. And this species in particular is pretty odd. It's rare and localized, and for a very long time, it was thought of as a water lily specialist, hence the name. But we found it visiting 14 different kinds of flowers, and it actually almost never visited water lily. So the more evidence we gather and the more I've heard from colleagues, the more it's looking like it probably isn't a specialist at all, which means that we actually don't know why it only lives in wetlands. And to me, that opens all sorts of new doors for exciting future research. But the fact that this rare bee is not only common here, but playing a big role in visiting so many flowers, it shows that these networks in wetlands have some unique characteristics that are worth appreciating and worth protecting. So now I wanted to highlight the plants with the greatest degree, so the most influential plants in our network. And right up at the top here is pickerelweed. This is a wonderful plant if you don't already know it. It has a lot of value for fish and wildlife and also to pollinators. In the eastern US, it has 3 specialists, one of which we did find in our study. And we found it to have the greatest relative abundance of bees and a huge diversity of bees visiting it. It was really popular with bumblebees too, including one of our at-risk species. This is a plant that blooms for a very long time, almost the entire summer, and it grows in standing water, so you tend to see it around the edges of ponds and lakes. Another standout plant was nodding burr marigold. This is a species of bidens or beggar ticks, probably the showiest, and it's an annual that really comes up heavily after those full drawdowns. It blooms late in September, but when it does, it is incredibly abundant. And when I say abundant, I really mean abundant. This was a common sight at the impoundments in September. This is all going to go to seed, and it's those hooked seeds that stick to your clothes, but it's great food for birds and wildlife. So burr marigold will grow in moist soil or very shallow water, and it wasn't used a whole lot by solitary bees, not as much as we would have expected, but it was used a lot by social bees like bumblebees and honeybees. And that makes it a key resource in the fall when those colonies are producing males and next year's queens. Then we had swamp smartweed, which is one of several species of perennial smartweed, and it bloomed for a fairly long period of time. Land managers often divide smartweeds into annual or perennial. So the annuals, like Pennsylvania smartweed, tend to benefit from those drawdowns and produce a lot of seeds for waterfowl, while the perennial ones tend to be in the wetter areas, and they're often not really managed for. But maybe they should be. This species grew in short mats along the water's edge, and they were covered with bees and wasps, while the annual species didn't really get that much activity in our study. And of course, goldenrod, which in all situations is an all-star when it comes to pollinators. Giant goldenrod prefers moist soils and it blooms late in the season. This plant had the greatest relative diversity of bees and the most specialists collected from it, like this Protandrina here. Despite the fact that we only saw it, the plant at 2 sites out of 3 dozen. So wherever goldenrods of any kind occur, they are a bee magnet. I will also give honorable mentions to sneezeweed and swamp vervain, which also attracted a high diversity of bees. Now, on the other hand, we had a handful of flowers that were rarely visited by bees or any other pollinators for that matter. So that included some of our aquatic plants like bladderwort and the invasive frogbit, both of which had showy flowers. It also included the parasitic vine dodder, which is a really unique and interesting looking plant. And it's actually the host plant for a very rare specialist bee, which clearly did not occur at our sites because this plant was never visited by anything. What was most surprising for us was swamp rose mallow, our native hibiscus. Despite being incredibly abundant, was almost never visited by any pollinator. It has a specialist bee as well that does most of its pollinating, but that specialist doesn't occur as far north as our study sites. This actually led to a follow-up study that I did a couple summers ago that we're still analyzing the data for, where I went to different sites across the Northeast to document what was visiting these flowers. And I can confirm that if its specialist isn't there, almost nothing visits it. So there are many mysteries about wetland flowers yet to unravel. And there are definitely plants that are favored by bees in these wetlands. So to return to our networks, we can break these down by month and compare their structure. Connectance and nestedness, which are usually correlated with each other, were both highest in September and lowest in June. And modularity, that measure of compartmentalization, was highest in June and lowest in September. That means September had plant-pollinator interactions that were more functionally redundant, and that might lead to greater stability. This pattern also holds when you compare August to June, which both had the same number of plant species in their networks. August had the greater relative connectance and nestedness and lower modularity, again suggesting the robustness of these networks later in the season. Now, of course, this isn't to say that these managed emergent wetlands didn't also have flowers earlier on. There were plenty like the ones that you see here. But those floral resources were proportionally more native, more diverse, and like you saw with that burr marigold, more abundant as the season went on, really peaking in that late season. And the plants in our networks that were most heavily used by bees were all species that were blooming in the late season, whether that was because they only bloomed late or because they bloomed for a long time into the late summer. These plants spanned a variety of hydrological conditions. So pickerelweed was an open water plant. Some of them were soggy soil plants, and others were wet meadow or moist soil plants. And that tells us that there's no single best kind of wetland for bees. They're using all of these habitats, particularly later in the summer. There was really only one place we didn't find flowers for pollinators, and it was in stands of Phragmites or dense cattails, usually the invasive narrow-leaved cattail. Invasive plants that form these dense monocultures degrade habitat for most wildlife and for pollinators too. Native cattails can form dense stands, but we often did see patches of flowers interspersed with them. Even so, we recognize that some wetland birds and wildlife do need this dense cover, and not everything can and should be pollinator habitat. But one thing we can do in these cases is try and manage for wet edges. Wet edges have to do with the topography of these impoundments. So how gradual the transition is between upland to wetland, how steep the berms are, and maybe how high the water levels are kept at. These edges can be rich with wetland flowers like goldenrods, Joe pieweed, boneset, jewelweed, and shrubs like dogwoods and elderberries, all sorts of moist soil species. You can see how these flowers here line the edge of this berm before it drops off into the wetland basin where it becomes cattails and red maples. And this is a management action that could be planned for ahead of time during restoration, with minimal impact on the rest of the wetland for other target wildlife. But it could add some more of these flowers back in. And it could also create visual appeal for public walking trails through wetlands. So what patterns did we see with the bee community? There were two main things. Firstly, those generalists, which make up most of our bees, including the at-risk bumblebees. They are eagerly using wetlands. They're probably not nesting in those inundated soils, though maybe the berms might offer some nesting spots, but mainly they're coming to the wetlands, seeking them out for their resources. And that really showcases the value of these habitats. They're drawing in a diversity of bees from surrounding uplands and offering important resources at a key time of year. That gives them great potential for being refuges in developed and fragmented landscapes like agriculture during a period of time when most crops are not flowering. The other thing we saw is all of those specialists. While a few of them were restricted to wetlands, most of them aren't. All the goldenrod specialists, for example, usually are found in uplands where most goldenrods grow. But they're clearly willing to use wetlands and use goldenrods in wetlands too. And that means wetlands could be a tool to support some of these specialists alongside just preserving meadows and other upland habitats. So these emergent wetlands, particularly those that were restored and are managed by people, what role are they playing for bees on the larger landscape? I think that they are an important component of that bloom turnover that bees rely on. They complement upland habitats like forests that have their peak wildflower bloom in spring, or shrublands that have shrubs blooming in spring and early summer, and the meadows which have a midsummer to fall bloom, which can be pretty profuse but might lack some of those deeper flowers. The emergent wetlands with their herbaceous vegetation also complement the habitat offered by other kinds of wetlands. Those that have more of a woody component, like bogs, fens, shrub wetlands, and swamps, have a stronger spring bloom. And that includes a lot of ericaceous plants, those in the heath family, like blueberries, rhododendrons, cranberries, huckleberries. All of these are important to pollinators as spring resources, and they host many specialist bees too. The trees in these woody wetlands also play a big role, like red maple and willows. We saw before, willows in the Northeast are very important for our specialist bees, and they are used heavily by generalist bees and insects of all kinds. We even have a bee called the Parnassia mining bee that's restricted to rich calcareous fens, where it specializes on a flower called fengrass of Parnassus. So emergent wetlands are one component. They slot into the landscape alongside meadows and forests and alongside bogs and swamps, all coming together to provide the habitats for our entire native bee diversity. So what does this ultimately mean? It means that wetland management can be another useful tool in our arsenal to protect our native pollinators. When we restore wetlands from agriculture or other forms of degradation, we know that it benefits wildlife, and it almost certainly is benefiting pollinators a lot too. The active management that we use to control water levels and influence plant communities helps maintain this matrix of diverse conditions that makes productive habitat for birds and a lot of flowers for bees. Many of the plants that we already manage for birds are showing here to be good for bees too. This is really encouraging that the goals of wildlife conservation, wetland function, and pollinator conservation are compatible. And that makes a strong case for being able to incorporate pollinators into existing and future wetland management. Lastly, maintaining a diversity of wetland types on the landscape, from full drawdowns and cattail marshes to bogs and beaver ponds, will maximize the number of species we can support. All of these different habitats have value. So I'll leave you with these parting thoughts. We, as the public and as scientists and land managers, need to rethink what pollinator habitat looks like. Meadows are great and they're easy to grow, but they're only one slice of the pie when it comes to what pollinators need. A huge diversity of bees use wetlands, including some that pollinate our crops, at-risk species, and bees that live nowhere else. We need more surveys like this done in other parts of the country. And we need regular people using citizen science, like iNaturalist, to log the pollinators you see when you visit wetlands, so we can better understand some of those rare bees, like our water lily masked bee. We'd also love it if folks planted some of these beautiful wetland flowers around their own homes and in their communities. This picture here is of a wet meadow planting outside one of our local nature centers, and it is just so gorgeous in August. There are so many opportunities to get wetland plants into the urban landscape through rain gardens and bioswales that help improve water quality, reduce flooding, and prevent erosion. Even if you just have a wet patch in your yard, don't force it to be lawn. Try putting some wetland plants in there. I think it'll be a lot happier. And you will be rewarded with incredible beauty and color and a stunning diversity of pollinators too. So thank you for being here this evening. I really appreciate you tuning in. And I'd like to just thank the agencies and organizations that have made this research possible, as well as our field techs and the other members of the ESF Bee Lab. So thank you guys so much, and I'm happy to stick around for questions.
Awesome, Molly. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. And just love thinking about the diversity of habitat and how many species need so many different things and how they can be complemented in the landscape. Just beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we do have some questions. We'll first start out with a kind of direct one of if you were able to detect nighttime pollinators, or do you think about nighttime pollination?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting topic. When we think of nighttime pollinators, at least in our region, that's going to be a lot of moths, particularly the sphinx moths. In other parts of the country, we've got bats filling that role as well, not so much in the eastern US. But yeah, that's something that, I mean, I'm very much into moths. We love doing black lighting events here to try and document moth diversity. And that is also a great citizen science tool. Anyone can do it. Anyone can find new rare species right in their yard, so I recommend it. We didn't do that for this study. That would have been a logistical nightmare to try and get out there at night as well. But that's something that I think, when it comes to sampling insects and different groups of insects, that can tell us a lot about a habitat. Bees, moths, sometimes beetles, ants. There are different groups that are really like indicator groups that have a huge diversity, and moths are incredibly diverse. So that is something that there are dedicated moth labs out there doing that, but also that is something that anyone can do. And I would love to do, like, if I could do a version of this study that was just at night, I think we would absolutely get some really interesting species. I believe Montezuma they have an Audubon Center, and they actually do moth blacklighting as a public event during National Moth Week every year. So that's something that's on the radar, but it will be cool to do like a long-term survey of that, certainly.
Thank you. One question. So, yeah, you did a great job explaining how ground nesting bees work and how these wetlands, maybe that's not exactly where the bees are making their nests, but that is what they're being pulled there by the abundant resources that are there. But can you speak to overwintering in this system, and how do these, are they overwintering elsewhere? Can you just speak more to the overwintering?
Yeah, so ground nesting bees, as you said, they are probably not nesting in the wetland itself because the soils do get flooded for a part of the year. And if the bees tried to do that, I think their populations would crash pretty quickly because the generations wouldn't make it every year. Like I mentioned, sometimes I think the berms are probably there are probably bees nesting in those berms. We looked during that period of time when we were trying to figure out where those sand obligate sweat bees were. We did look in the berms and they weren't there. We did find them in the farm fields out where the sand was. But that's definitely an area of higher ground that is not going to be flooded, that often is sloped, so it might get really good sun exposure. So I don't doubt that there are probably bees nesting in those berms. But at the same time, a lot of in our system, the surrounding habitat with these wetlands, a lot of it was surrounded by forest. Some of it was agriculture, some of it was grassland. So there was a lot of habitats in close proximity to each other, and that gave bees and all pollinators, I think, a good amount of habitats to choose from in order to nest. We definitely did get bees that were forest associated, and they probably just were flying right from the forest into the wetland to get those flowers. In terms of overwintering, most bees are, well, pretty much all bees are, except for bumblebees, are overwintering in the same place that they are nesting. As I said, adult bees only live a couple months. So that for most bees, that same bee is not going to survive another winter. But when it comes to so the ground nesting bees, wherever they are finding a place that is safe in an upland, those larvae are going to be spending the winter in that ground nest underground. If it's a stem nesting species, they're going to be nesting in a stem that is sturdy, that's going to persist and won't rot or be cut down, and that is where they are spending the winter. We often have wondered whether, the stems of like the Phragmites reed would be someplace that bees might even be nesting in, and we don't know. I don't think there's ever really been a study on that, but there's always a risk there of flooding, and so I'm not sure if bees would be taking that chance. Bumblebees are going to be overwintering. It's a little bit of a different case because they are social bees. So at the end of the season, the colony produces gynes, which are next year's queens. They go out, they mate, they put on as much fat reserves as they can, and they find a place to overwinter, generally in the leaf litter. So that is going to be more of a forested habitat or someplace with a lot of thatch or otherwise dense cover. So again, probably not where it's going to get flooded or covered with snowpack that's going to then flood in the spring again. So for the most part, we don't really see that bees are going to nest in the wetland basin itself. But depending on how that management is done, if there are areas that consistently are more of a moist soil or wet edge, and that doesn't get flooded, but maybe just the water table is a little higher, they could be nesting there. But it's probably safer if they don't. What's really interesting, I'll just add, is that there are a couple of bee species, not here, but there's one in Florida, that are adapted to nest underwater. And it's fascinating. They are actually adapted to be able to survive several months of a flooded nest. But we certainly don't have that here. So we're going to guess that the bees are nesting in the uplands around the wetlands.
That's awesome. But it's also awesome to think about the interconnectedness of these historic landscapes and how there were wetlands and forests and gradients, and yeah, and I also loved what you said with the cattail monocultures, that, not that we should want a cattail monoculture everywhere, but you just said the sentiment of not everything needs to be pollinator habitat, and that's usually,
I know it's hard to say, but we see the same thing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you please do.
I was just going to say that we see the same thing with like conifer forests. So there's a lot, forests are very important pollinator habitat, but not so much in dense conifer forests. But we know that dense conifer forests are a very important habitat, just not for bees. So we would never advocate for you to get rid of the conifer forest to plant more flowers. And I'll just add also an interesting thing that we saw about the nesting that kind of also gave us a clue was that, so those cuckoo bees that we mentioned earlier, you tend to find those often searching for host nests. So they're often along the ground, looking for where those ground nesting bees are located. And we caught very, very few cuckoo bees in this study. Usually you can find them at a fairly good proportion. And we had very, very few, far fewer than you would expect from just an average survey. And that really tells us that they are not in those habitats looking for host nests. When we did find them, they were on flowers. So that again is a sign for us that they are probably not nest seeking in the wetlands themselves.
Awesome. Cool insight that you could, see in two different ways that sort of nesting behavior. But so cool. This is really cool stuff. We had one question about, so you mentioned invasive plants, and we think a lot about invasive plants. And can you maybe share again the top species that you saw, other things you observed with the invasive plants in these sites?
Sure. We had a number of invasive plants out there. So a lot of it was Phragmites, the common reed there. We had a lot of narrow-leaved cattail. So out there we have broad-leaved cattail, which is the native, and the narrow-leaved, which is the invasive. And then they also hybridize to make a hybrid cattail, which is also invasive. So we would see all of those out there, and they do differ not just in the width of the cattail blade, but also in the structure of habitat that they create. Narrow-leaved cattail tends to be this very dense sort of homogeneous stand, whereas the broad-leaved cattail is more in clumps, and that leaves space between them. Space for, I'm sure, for wildlife to navigate, space for other plants to persist in there. So we'd often come upon just like a patch of giant swamp milkweed in the middle of the cattail or something like that. Don't tend to see that in the narrow-leaved cattail. It's a lot more homogeneous. We had reed canary grass, which is more of a moist soil wetland edge plant, but incredibly invasive. We had flowering rush, which was an interesting one because it was actually quite popular with, not with bees as much, but syrphid flies. The flower flies really liked the flowering rush. And it's a beautiful plant, but it is quite invasive. Oh gosh, we had so many invasives. But yeah, it was interesting that we would catch bees sometimes in the dense cattail stands when we put out the traps, but there were no flowers. And so, not to get into methodology too much, but there is a phenomenon where if you put traps in a place where there's no flowers, they'll more likely go to it because they think it's the only flower in the area. And so occasionally we think putting bright yellow traps in the middle of a cattail stand will catch a few bees, but in general, not that many in the cattail. But yeah, the Phragmites is definitely a problem out there, as it is with so many places. And Montezuma does an incredible job of really battling back a lot of these invasives and restoring that habitat. So while there was invasives out there, as there are going to be at any wetland that you encounter these days, the amount of nice native habitat, it far exceeds that. And that's something that they're working on all the time. And it shows with the quality of habitat for the waterfowl that are out there, because it is such an important bird area. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's, I guess what I can say on the invasives is that they were there, and there weren't flowers where they were there. But otherwise, we had a lot of nice, really high quality native habitat there too.
Great, thank you. We also think a lot about burning with prairies and these grassland-dominated ecosystems or grass-dominated ecosystems. Yeah. Can you speak to, any presence of fire in these maybe ephemerally wet ecosystems?
Yeah. I couldn't tell you if historically fire was a tool to manage these, but I will say that currently fire is a tool that is used to manage some of the invasives. yeah, Phragmites being one of them, that there is sort of a cycle of burning, mowing, cutting, herbiciding that you gotta use to beat them back. And yeah, when fire is possible to do in these systems safely, it is definitely a useful tool to burn a lot of that that graminoid foliage, that really dense stuff, because Phragmites is just so difficult to get both the above and below ground growth. So that is a tool that is used at Montezuma to manage some of the invasives. I don't know, I'm not aware of anything where fire is used to manage or promote the natives in these habitats. They do mowing, they do scouring, they do the drawdowns, and they occasionally use the spot treating, the herbicides. But in general, yeah, when I think of the fire, I think of them doing that for invasives management.
Great, thank you. I'll just give you one more question, which is just, what is, if you were to do another study in this system, or, what is the future of your work, or maybe of work in this area? What sort of lingering next steps? You mentioned some, but we can leave on that note.
Yeah, this was an incredible project that really was such a learning process and a journey for me. I've worked with wetlands previously in a number of seasonal positions, and somehow I keep coming back to wetlands, so that's a sign. And yes, like it has opened up a lot of new questions because it really made me realize how little research has been done. And much of what has been done was done in Europe, which is not always applicable to here. There have been a couple of good studies, one in the Mississippi alluvial valley that was done, and one in the prairie pothole region, and a couple of other smaller ones. But this was, yeah, not much in the Northeast at all. And pretty much everything we found, opened new doors for questions, more questions than answers. What we do right now is, well, I'll say, when it comes to wetlands, apart from some of these offshoot studies, I've tried really hard to work on citizen science. What we're doing, trying to get a lot more people out into wetlands thinking about pollinators, because it's typically not what you think of when you go to visit a wetland. There's a lot of things to look at in wetlands, but no one's paying attention to the little bees on the flowers. And so I try to advocate when I do talks and things, is that when you go to a wetland, just photograph the bees that you see and throw them on iNaturalist or something, because most likely it's some kind of weird record that we don't have yet. And they're really under documented in a lot of places. So some of these bees, like that water lily masked bee, is very distinctive. The pickerel weed bees are also very distinctive, but there's just not a lot of records of them, even though we know they must be occurring in more places. It's just that nobody is finding them or looking for them. So that's one side of it. On the other hand, a lot of what our lab currently does is projects looking at all sorts of different habitats that tend to be understudied, and that might have really critical roles for pollinators. So we have a large power line right-of-way study going on, and in the bee world, power line rights of way are considered like one of the holy grails of just like rare bees, and bee diversity, as like native shrubland, native open habitats in the Northeast. So we have projects trying to go to these rare habitats, and try and document what bees are there and how they're using the habitat. I did a project recently with American chestnuts, trying to find a rare chestnut mining bee. It's a specialist on chestnut that was thought to have gone extinct for several decades. We did find it in New York. So it's really spurred my interest in focusing more on understudied habitats, and bees that are not recorded very often, trying to re-find these things instead of just surveying the same fields and meadows over and over again and finding what we already know is there. So that's where it has, I think that's where this has really led me in the direction of, is I would love to do more things with wetlands, but also just in general, the topics of finding and appreciating these habitats that we don't typically think of as pollinator habitat, but they're all part of the landscape and they're all important.
Totally. Thank you so much, Molly. Great talk. I appreciate your time, and we're getting thank yous in the chat. So thank you. And
Thank
I'll
you
pass
all
it over
for
to
having
Amanda.
me.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you again, Molly, and to you, Lily, for guiding us through the live questions. Access to this recording and all other related information shared by Molly will be sent to all who registered in a follow up email tomorrow. Now, I'd like to review some of our upcoming in person and online events. You can register now and join us Wednesday, May 7th at 4 p.m. for our native plants and neotropical bird migration webinar with migratory bird biologist Sarah Kendrick. Then save the date to register and join us at 4 p.m. on May 21st for our next Grow Native Masterclass, Native Perennials for Planting on Slopes, with Shannon Curry, leader of Education and Outreach with Grow Native member Isel Native Plants. If you have a hunger for more webinar content on native plants, we recommend registering for the ongoing Partners for Native Landscaping series offered spring and fall, with registration facilitated online by the St. Louis County Library. Next, we have an ongoing opportunity to purchase quality products from our Grow Native professional members at native plant sales across Missouri. More information on each sale, including participating vendors and pre order details, can be found across all of our channels and in the follow up email reaching your inbox tomorrow. This Saturday, we'll actually be out at the Bass Pro in Springfield, Missouri from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. When you're done picking up new additions to your garden, you can meet us at the Springfield Earth Day Festival event in Jordan Valley Park that benefits MPF. Tickets for that event right now are BOGO, so check out their website and get yours and a friend's. As a matter of fact, we are engaging with Earth Day events all over Missouri this coming weekend, with a list to be included in our follow up email and on our socials. We hope to see you there. Next, guided prairie walks, hikes of natural areas, and tours of native plantings are open for registration and ongoing on our website under the Events tab. For the latest event updates, remember to sign up for our biweekly newsletter to get these events and more directly into your inbox. Finally, I want to inform everyone that pre giving for Give STL Day on May 8th has begun. Early bird gifts on behalf of the Missouri Prairie Foundation will be matched 100% thanks to generous donor matches. We look forward to sharing more on this opportunity in the days to come. Thank you again, Molly, for joining us and for sharing more about your lab and your research. We look forward to hearing more as more is developed.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Everyone, have a great night. Bye.